Hello, my name is Syamirza and I will be explaining about relative phrases and clauses. Let's begin. Before we learn about relative phrases and clauses, let's better understand the definition of them first. A relative phrase is a sentence containing a relative pronoun to combine two or more clauses together to form a larger sentence, while a relative clause, on the other hand, is a clause containing a word or a phrase in common with the main clause of its sentence. You might be wondering, what is a clause? A clause is essentially a group of words put together to sound like a sentence on its own. A clause by itself can be a sentence, but you can also put two or more clauses together into one larger sentence. In fact, one way to do that is with relative clauses. It is called a relative clause because it contains a word or a phrase in common with the main clause of its sentence. In other words, when you try to put two or more clauses together, you would first have to identify which one is the main clause and which one is the relative clause. When you try to put these two clauses together, you would then have to use a relative pronoun to combine them and create a relative phrase. So, let's learn about relative pronouns and how you can use them to create your own relative phrases. Here are 5 of the common relative pronouns that you can use. The first one is who for people. The second is which for things, ideas, and situations. The third is where for places. The fourth is when for time. And last but not least, whose, which is used for possessive pronouns. I will further explain about these 5 pronouns later on in the video, but please keep in mind that these are the 5 pronouns that we will use. Here is an example of having two clauses with shared pronouns as well as a relative pronoun used to create your relative phrase. The first clause, I'm excited to meet Cassandra Clare. The second clause, Cassandra Clare is my favorite author. When trying to combine these two clauses, you can use the relative pronoun who because you are referring to Cassandra Clare, which is a person. So an example of what it sounds like when you combine these two clauses is, I'm excited to meet Cassandra Clare, who is my favorite author. Next, let's learn how you can put together clauses so that you can form your own relative phrases. The first step is to find the common noun in both sentences. Once you have found that common noun, you can then easily identify what to do next. The second step is to determine the main clause and the relative clause between the two sentences. Typically, it doesn't matter which one is the main clause or the relative clause, but you have to keep in mind the context of the sentence which you want to relate to people. The relative clause is a clause which conveys more info which is available in the main clause. So it all depends on context. Once you have determined the main clause and the relative clause, you then have to place the relative clause after the common noun in the main clause. I will show you an example later on. The third step is to delete the common noun from the relative clause. And finally, the fourth step is to add a pronoun at the front of the relative clause. Here is an easy way for you to visualize the steps that you would have to take. But please keep these steps in mind as we go further into the examples that I will explain. Here is an example of constructing a relative phrase. We have two clauses here, as well as two relative phrases. For the first relative phrase is an example if you chose clause 1 as your main clause, and relative phrase 2 is an example if you chose clause 2 as your main clause. So whichever way you choose, it all depends on context. The first clause, we watched Eternals in theaters last week. The second clause, Eternals is the latest Marvel film. So depending on the clauses available for you, if you chose the first clause as your main clause, it would sound something like relative phrase 1. We watched Eternals, which is the latest Marvel film, in theaters last week. In this relative phrase, you can clearly see that the context is focusing more on the fact that we watched Eternals in theaters last week. The second clause becomes an additional information which you put into the main clause. When you put it vice versa, it becomes like the example in relative phrase 2. Eternals, which we watched in theaters last week, is the latest Marvel film. Here, you can clearly see that you're more focusing on the fact that Eternals is the latest Marvel film. And clause 1, which we watched in theaters last week, becomes an additional information for the listener. Next, here is another example for you to see. First clause is, my favorite time of day is after the sun sets. The second clause is, the stars can be seen shining brightly after the sun sets. Here, just like the previous example, you can do it vice versa, whether choose clause 1 as your main clause or choose clause 2 as your main clause. Either way, you can still create a good relative phrase as a full sentence. But it all depends on context and the flow of the sentence to make it sound more natural. In the relative phrase example I have written here, I wrote, my favorite time of day is after the sun sets, when the stars can be seen shining brightly. In this relative phrase example, you can clearly see that clause 1 became the main clause. But if you were to do it vice versa and choose clause 2 as your main clause, the sentence would still be a perfectly structural sentence. But the flow of the sentence might sound a bit off. So always try to experiment with your sentences and try to create a relative phrase which sounds more natural to the person listening to it. Here is an example of a possessive relative pronoun. The first clause is I'm looking for Ellie, and the second clause is Ellie's bag is pink. So in this sentence, you can clearly see that the person in the sentence is looking for Ellie, but they're identifying Ellie by the thing that she possesses, which is her bag, which is pink. So in the example sentence of the relative phrase, I'm looking for Ellie whose bag is pink. So in other words, when you're trying to refer to something that is in possession of someone, you have to use whose. Next, even though relative clauses are typically used for shared nouns, you can also use verb phrases as relative phrases. In clause 1, Anna always eats junk food. Clause 2, eating junk food is really unhealthy. In the example relative phrase that I have given here, it sounds like Anna always eats junk food, which is really unhealthy. So when you're talking about Anna eating junk food, it's not the junk food that is really healthy, but the act of Anna always eating it. So in this situation, the action of Anna always eating junk food is really unhealthy. So you have to use the relative pronoun which, because it refers to the entire sentence, not just Anna itself or the junk food itself. So I hope that better explains relative phrases and relative clauses to you, just by a little bit if you didn't understand before. So as a conclusion, relative phrases and relative clauses are used to make the sentence sound more natural and flow more easily. So when you're trying to create your own relative phrases and clauses, just keep in mind that you can always experiment with your arrangement so that it can sound more natural and it will bring more context and more info to the main sentence that you're trying to convey. Thank you for your time, and please leave any questions in the comments down below and let me know that was this video helpful, and I hope it gave you some insight into relative phrases and clauses. Thank you.